Hey guys, Level Cap here. Today's Monday, which means it's time for an episode of Loadout, the series where you guys, the viewers, get to pick a gun and customization for me to use. The way you do this is you leave a comment down below letting me know what kind of weapon and accessories to run with, and I will pick one of the top rated comments. Now, we did have to skip over last week's episode simply because Battlefield 1 had just come out and I thought there was some better information to talk about other than Loadout, but now we can get back on track and let you guys decide what weapons you want me to focus on. And this time around there were a ton of comments about the M1903 Experimental for the Scout class. Our top comment comes from Frank Bradley. He says, do the M1903 Experimental with the 1903 hammerless and the US trench knife. Now there's only one problem with this comment here, and that the 1903 hammerless is not for the Scout class, so I picked a gun that's basically the equivalent of that, which is the Frommerstab. In fact, I'd argue that the Frommerstab is a little bit worse simply because it has one less bullet per magazine. Now, the M1903 Experimental is a unique weapon to say the least. It is the only non-bolt action rifle for the Scout class. I mean, it can actually be converted into a bolt action rifle to fire the K bullets, which has got a crazy animation for it, but for the most part, this is the only way around using a bolt action for the Scout class if you really don't want to. If you don't want to use a bolt action though, I wouldn't necessarily recommend running with the M1903 Experimental. You'd probably be better off with a different class. Now you might be looking at this gun and thinking, hey, isn't this just a bolt action with a funky looking magazine sticking out the side? Yeah, that's exactly what this is. Now what happened is during the war, the US secretly developed a device called the Pedersen Device, and that allowed a soldier to convert their bolt action rifle into a semi-automatic SMG type weapon in about 15 seconds, which is kind of a cool conversion process. And that's what we're using here. The only downside, of course, is that it shoots 30 caliber pistol type cartridges, so they don't do a huge amount of damage, and it certainly shows in this game. Pulling up the stats from Synthic.com, we can see that the weapon only does 23 maximum damage per shot. Mind you, this is a semi-automatic weapon, so basically you need to spam fire a lot. If I could rename this weapon, I'd call it Carpal Tunnel Express. Now the gun itself shoots at 449 rounds per minute, but it only does 23 maximum damage. That means that tiny little Frommerstab handgun I have for a sidearm is actually more effective in close quarters than this weapon, aside from the fact that it doesn't have a 40 round magazine. In fact, let's put the Frommerstab stats next to the M1903 Experimental and see how this handgun is actually significantly better than the primary weapon. Same rate of fire, but higher damage per shot in close quarters, and it has much better hipfire accuracy, which again is a much more beneficial attribute to have in close quarter combat. So if I see somebody up close and personal, I may as well just switch to my sidearm, because there's no point in running the primary up close. The only time the primary is a little bit better than the sidearm is at semi-medium range, but at that point you may as well be using just about any other gun in the game. The 1903 Experimental is an excellent example of DICE just having very poor weapon balance early in their games. I don't know what niche this weapon is supposed to fit. If you want a gun that's good at medium range or can be spam fired, you may as well pick a medic gun, because they're going to be way better. They're going to 3-shot kill somebody instead of 5-shot kill somebody. I really just don't like anything about this gun, especially the fact that my hand hurts right now, because getting 100+ kills with this to grab some footage for the M1903 Experimental meant spamming that left click button to an extent that is just purely unhealthy. Now, in real life, I can see the point of this attachment. It would make more sense, because if you're using the M1903 as a long-range rifle and then you get in close to your enemies, you're storming a building or some trenches or whatever, you might want something that can be fired much quicker. That way you don't have to issue every soldier on the battlefield an SMG, a shotgun, and a long-range rifle. It allows them to adapt to close quarter combat when needed. It's not necessarily going to be an ideal close quarter weapon, but it's going to be better than having a bolt action rifle going into CQB combat and having to rely primarily on bayonet warfare. So the design actually made a lot of sense at the time, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense as its own standalone weapon. Now you can try and replicate the experience that somebody might have had during World War I, even though I don't think this attachment was deployed during the war, because it wasn't finished till like the end of 1918 or something, so it was never shipped overseas. But if you want to run with K bullets and you activate a K bullet, you'll actually take out the bolt for this weapon and switch it over to shoot K bullets, which is kind of like what you would have done in World War I had it been deployed. But if you're not running with K bullets, then you can't really switch the weapon. And honestly, the whole switching and conversion process is a little bit gimmicky. So the concept of the weapon for the war makes sense. The concept of running with this as a primary setup for Battlefield 1 doesn't make a lot of sense. And it certainly isn't particularly well balanced. They could have made it a much more effective weapon had they given it pistol-like damage, allowing it to do something like 26 or more damage per shot, so you could get a 4-shot kill instead of a 5-shot kill in close quarters. There's plenty of things they could have done to try and make this a more effective weapon or a more interesting weapon. They just haven't, so it's pretty damn hard to recommend the M1903 Experimental. It certainly is one of the more unique weapons in Battlefield 1 and has that sort of cool factor going for it, but when it comes to actual effectiveness of this gun, it is something that I don't look forward to using ever again, until they balance it anyway. Now, you know what would have been actually pretty cool is if the M1903 just came with an alternate fire mode where you could put this Pedersen device into the weapon and just convert it to semi-automatic SMG type weapon. And that way they wouldn't have to necessarily balance it out and make it crazy good. It would just be an alternate fire in case you knew you needed to get into close quarter combat. That would actually be really cool in that it would replicate the real life function of the Pedersen device. And since the M1903 in-game is currently designed for pretty long range bolt action use, this would give it kind of a cool alternative fire mode designed for primarily close range. So you would have basically two fire modes that were fairly fast to switch between. One thing that is commendable about this game is DICE's attention to detail, their research for the different kinds of devices and weapons, and the fact that they actually created the animation to switch out the actual bolt for the gun to switch it in between bolt action and semi-automatic. It's pretty cool, and that's a fairly complicated animation to come up with anyway. So since it's already in the game, it wouldn't be that hard to kind of redesign the M1903 class of weapon just a little bit to make it more interesting. Now, it seems like most Battlefield games launch with fairly all over the place weapon balance. Some guns are good, some guns are completely unusable, and some guns are just like totally overpowered compared to everything else in the game. And it takes quite a while for DICE to rein it in. And it does surprise me a little bit. I mean, obviously, there's always going to be balance issues with any shooter that comes out, and you have to sort of test it out in a public environment and see how it works out. So it's hard to predict how things might work out. But at the same time, there's just weapons like this one here that just on a stat level, stacking it up against fast-firing pistols, it's inferior, and it's hard to know what the intention of this weapon was. I'm sure there was an intention, but it's pretty confusing to me since it seems to be designed for medium close range combat, yet it's not as good as pretty much every other weapon designed for medium close range combat. So unfortunately, for quite some time, there's just going to be some guns out there that if you pick up and you're like, man, I'm just really sucking today, it might not be you. It might actually be the gun this time around. Sure, I was able to top a few servers using this gun, but I mean, at that point I was going up against opponents that weren't really that effective against me, and had I been using better weapons, man, my score would have been like through the roof by comparison. So don't let the fact that I'm showing you guys footage of me like dominating people at times using this gun fool you. I can show you footage of me dominating people with just about any gun in the game. It doesn't mean it's a good gun. Now, of course, there is one small saving grace about this weapon, provided that you can down your opponents in some sort of timely manner. And that's the fact that it has a 40-round magazine that's got like the potential to kill up to 8 bad guys before you need to reload, provided that you actually hit all your shots. But it's a good magazine capacity. The only problem is that you probably won't have time to get through all of those bullets because the time to kill is so unimpressive that you're just going to lose out to most other weapons in the game. So is the M1903 Experimental a cool weapon? Absolutely, for the fact that it was an interesting conversion kit for a bolt-action rifle. Very, very interesting piece of technology for the time period. In-game, at its current state, it is not a good gun to use. So use it aesthetically, not strategically. That wraps it up for today's episode of Loadout. Don't forget to leave your comments down below. And as always, I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.